we walk through our ordinary day. We walk through our ordinary life. We do the things that are required of us. We go to our jobs. We spend time with our partners. We live our lives. And that's a certain level of existence. And then there are those special times, or those times that suddenly we sense something else. We sense something more about ourselves. We hear or feel a greater presence. We know that we experience ourselves as more than we think we are. We have a moment of connection when we look at someone and everything else falls away. Or we have a moment of extraordinary generosity that pours through us. Or we have a moment where we're pierced in a way that suddenly everything opens and we feel a profound sense of connection. So what is that other? What is that essence that we are tapping into? What is that quality of love that allows us to be more deeply and fully who we are? And perhaps this is some of the nature of the soul active in our life.
In many ways, the whole path, or the awakening to the path, is an awakening to one's own duality, an awakening to the realization that where we are on our journey of evolution, we start to realize that there's really two of us inside. And we slowly, very slowly, become both sensitive to the day-to-day consciousness that we have, as well as a higher prompting, a higher sense. We start to wake up to something that almost feels Christ-like within us, where there's a sense of expansive oneness, as we've talked about in the past, where we've talked about this idea that underlying it all is oneness. The soul inside us is the part of us that senses that greater unitive field and is a part of it. When we feel that unitive field, it's the soul that's doing the perceiving at that moment. While the personality, on the other hand, is quite different. The personality, it's governed by separative perspective, separative consciousness. The personality, actually, it prizes, or let me put it this way, it has a heightened awareness of how it's different from another, whereas the soul is particularly attentive of how it's the same as another. Now, the personality, in its separative tendency, it will either be heightened in its awareness of how it's different from another, leading to an egotistical development. That's what the so-called ego, when we conventionally use that term, that ego is all about an accent of the separative consciousness and a kind of prizing that uniqueness. It can also manifest as separative, as in envy. So seeing something in another person that you begin to envy, that's always going to be personality, because again, it's based upon a separative perspective. So one of the big contrasts between soul and personality is unitive consciousness, unitive perception versus separative.
When we step upon the spiritual path, we hear of the terms personality and soul. And our objective is the soul, and our familiar, habitual, obvious presentation in life is called the personality. The personality is just the obvious self to me. It has a body, it has a certain electrical system that we call the etheric body. It's got an emotional nature where we feel our attractions and our repulsions, and our emotions are expressed there, and it has a concrete mind where we begin to learn about what is in our environment and to correlate it in some intelligent way. And that's all good, and it has to be developed very powerfully and integrated to have what's called the integrated personality, or the integrated intelligent natural man. The intelligence aspect is what we can apply to the personality. But beyond and within is an aspect of consciousness and being which some disciplines call the soul. We're calling it the soul. and it is found on a higher level of consciousness, and it's the real us. Well, it's more real than the personality. There's still more real us, or who we are, but our next adventure is to identify ourselves as the illumined, loving, sacrificially willing soul. And we can do that as we begin to serve, as we begin to look out for our fellow human beings, as we begin to take our eyes off of this habitual self. We can begin to do that, and we find ourselves slipping into a higher state of consciousness, which we call the soul, and which is our next objective in terms of our spiritual development. You know, what is soul, what is personality? You could go on forever, okay? But the whole idea is that the personality grasps for itself, if left to its natural methods, and the soul gives and contributes. So it's the source of us, in us, of altruism and of the heart vibration. The personality is intelligent, but the soul is loving, and loving in the light, and contributes to the welfare of others and feels itself linked to others. So when we are unselfish, it is the impulse of the soul. And when we are selfish, no matter how we justify that, you know, it is the impulse of the personality, which really is very limited in its self-perception and thinks that this is what I am. As a soul, we recognize we are everybody else as well.
Well, I think it's really important that we look at the world and see the world in its duality. See, if everything is living, that means that the social systems are also living. Nations are entities as well, and that everything is the outpicturing of consciousness. And because human consciousness is dual, we have a higher prompting and a lower tendency. The same is true as it plays out within larger living systems, whether we're talking about politics, science, the arts, religion, education. These are just categories of human consciousness. They're essential categories, actually, and those categories are evolving, but they are evolving and there's a dynamic between their higher potential, which is their soul nature, and their lower tendency, which is their personality. And that in many ways, the more we can become sensitive to our own duality, our soul personality dynamic, the more that we're able to perceive that very same dynamic playing out in larger living systems. And it could be, instead of a social system, it could be a nation. Every country is an entity too, and it has a soul and it has a personality. And indeed, many of the world problems today are because the soul of humanity is trying to impress more of itself into the personality of humanity, and that personality, elements of it, shadow elements, to use a Jungian term, those shadow elements are fearful and they're rising up in defiance. So much of the problems we see in the world today are really actually almost predictable. When greater light tries to impress itself into form, there will be a reaction, and it will force negative elements out of the shadows. And we see that happening today all around the world, whether it's having to do with corrupt politicians or corruption around business, or we see the rise of the jihadist movement. All of these represent shadowy elements within the collective consciousness of humanity, or within the consciousness of a nation or a theology, and greater light is trying to impress, and those negative elements come to the surface to resist. And it's so interesting because if you think about it yourself in our own lives, I know in my life, there are times when that my lower self seems to want to put up a greater fight against my higher self. And the same is true in these larger systems. So service is based upon a recognition of that duality, and a recognition that what does it mean to serve, let's say in the field of business? Well, when you're on the path and you're sensing your own duality, you start to realize that business itself, or a particular business even, has a soul nature and a personality nature. And if you want, or if you're compelled or feel called to provide service, soulful service to that organization, the truth is you're trying to provide service to the soul hidden within that organization. So there's a direct parallel between our capacity to sense the soul inside us and our capacity to see the soul in larger systems and our level of commitment to make a service contribution on behalf of the soul of those larger systems.